Hi everyone, welcome back. I'm Nivii Kalavakonda from the University of Washington, and we are talking about learning from demonstration. In the previous video, we saw the challenges that come with solving reinforcement learning problems, especially for complex tasks or for working in unstructured environments because of this need to specify an explicit reward function. To be able to navigate this challenge, we thought about how humans understand learning and how some form of supervision can be very useful in guiding the learning process. When we looked at different examples of learning via supervision, we saw that this can come in three different flavors. One is learning from demonstration or imitation learning, where we generally tend to have an expert who's able to show us exactly the sequence of actions to take to perform a certain task. And from these demonstrations, we can extract a policy that our agent can then go on to use to execute tasks autonomously. In the second case of learning from observing the world, we may have scenarios where we're able to collect a wealth of information by sensing the environment, but we may not have a good description of what the task we want to solve is just yet. There is still a lot of value in trying to understand what exists within this data. We could, for instance, do feature extractions using unsupervised learning and have this at the ready so that when the task we want to solve becomes obvious, we can make use of this information to ramp up the training process pretty quickly. In the third case of learning from other tasks, we could potentially have cases where the agent already has some experience in solving tasks previously, and we're interested in generalizing to new skills without having to train from scratch every single time. There's possibilities for us to learn how to learn from these previous tasks that the agent has experience with, and this can be done with the use of things like meta-learning. We could also have cases where we have models that have been trained on internet scale data, like in the case of large language models or vision language models, and we can transfer knowledge from those models, like in the case of transfer learning, and generalize to new skill sets and develop on new skill sets pretty quickly. In this video series, we're interested in focusing our efforts in understanding imitation learning or learning from demonstration. When we're thinking about ways to learn from demonstrations, there are two different buckets of approaches that we can think about. The first is behavior cloning, where we want to mimic exactly what the demonstrator shows us and perform the same set of actions when the agent visits the same set of states that the demonstrator was in. And when we're thinking about inverse reinforcement learning, we want to go a little further and understand the intent behind performing a certain sequence of actions when we're looking to complete a certain task. The idea or the hope here is we are able to go beyond the abilities of the demonstrator, and we can generalize to tasks that are beyond what we've seen in the demonstrations themselves. In this video, we're going to take a look at the definition of these two approaches, and we'll also look at a few different studies from the literature that help us understand what some of the challenges could be and what are some of the techniques that we can potentially take to solve these problems. Imitation learning is still a very active area of research, and especially if you come from a controls background, I think this is a very exciting time to propose and answer a lot of questions within this realm. I'm very excited to talk to you about it, so let's get started. When we're thinking about behavior cloning, let's build up to the definition by starting off with an example. Let's think of an agent that is a self-driving car. We're interested in the self-driving car to be able to autonomously perform lane changes. The car is able to understand the state of the world by making use of images. So that's what we're representing by the state as here. And the goal in trying to perform lane changes is we want to do this in a safe manner. We don't want to crash into other vehicles. We don't want to take unsafe actions. The main set of actions that we are potentially interested in is to either move to the left, move to the right, or to continue going straight. When we think about reinforcement learning problems, maybe it's a little tricky for us to specify reward functions for these cases because this is a stochastic environment and there could be a lot of cases that we may not be able to account for when trying to train a policy. When we wear our demonstrator hat, maybe it is a little easier for us to show by controlling the steering wheel how to perform these actions of moving to the left lane, right lane, or staying in the same lane than it is to specify a reward function explicitly. The objective here is for us to learn a good policy that is able to give us a mapping between my states and my actions. As a demonstrator, maybe when I think about this to be a certain input to my learning function, what I can do is I can provide a label to this input by showing exactly what action to take when the agent is at this state S. If you think about it, all we're looking to do is just have the agent observe and replicate what the demonstrator is showing. Another thing to note is in trying to have a certain action associated with these states, we can think of this problem to also be one of supervised learning because we have an input, we have the corresponding label for the input, and we can use a lot of the tools that we already have ready from the supervised learning world. So we want to be able to mimic whatever the expert demonstrations are just purely using supervised learning. We can think of the state action pairs as data points that are mutually independent from other state action pairs for this process of learning. This, in a nutshell, is what we call behavior cloning. Let's ground this in a framework that we are a little more familiar with. When we're thinking about reinforcement learning, we have an agent that is going to learn through experience by interacting with the environment. And it is going to do this by taking a certain series of actions. And the goal is to figure out what the optimal policy pi is so that it accumulates the maximal amount of reward possible during these interactions. As a refresher, the policy is nothing but a probability that is assigned to all the actions that we can take when the agent is at a certain state. This policy pi could be any type of a learning function, and the theta right here is nothing but the learning parameters that are associated with that learning function. We saw a case where if we make use of a neural network, then this theta is nothing but the weights of the neural network. The challenge that comes with solving reinforcement learning problems is this need to specify an explicit reward function. What we are able to do with behavior cloning is kind of deal with, or rather not deal with rewards explicitly at all, but instead just make use of expert behaviors to be able to guide the learning process for our pi. What we want to do here is we are assuming the trajectories or the demonstrations that the expert is showing us is drawn from some sort of an optimal policy pi star. And we want to ensure that the agent's policy pi theta looks exactly like pi star. By the end of this learning process, we want to ensure that the actions that the agent takes when it visits certain states looks exactly like what my expert would take when they were at those states. This information is already available during the demonstration phase where there is a state action mapping. And what we want to do is ensure that our pi theta reflects very similar policies where when it finds the agent at a certain state, it takes an action that looks exactly like what my expert did. So this is where behavior cloning comes into play, where we're trying to mimic our expert demonstrations by making use of supervised learning. When we look at the literature for behavior cloning, one of the oldest examples comes from way back in the 1980s. This is a project called ALVIN, which comes from Carnegie Mellon University. Dean Pomerleau showed that when they made use of behavior cloning on NavLab, which is an autonomous test vehicle for following the road, they were able to execute autonomous policies where the agent, here the autonomous test vehicle, is able to follow the road after being trained on simulation-only data. Project Alvin made use of a 3-layer neural network, which again is really cool when we're thinking about this project having come from the 1980s. And if you pay attention to these different layers, we are only having a single hidden layer right here that has 29 hidden units. And the input images were 30 by 32 resolution. Because these images or the cameras were giving images with such low resolution, it was also possible to purely only train on simulation data and then deploy the trained model on the NavLab vehicle. In addition to the video data, they also made use of a rangefinder, and the trained policy would output different steering directions for the vehicle. Another fun fact about the project is it only made use of about 1,200 odd images, which if you think about the scale of data that we use these days, the size of the models and the resolution of the images, this is a really fascinating project that Dean Pomerleau showed behavior cloning on. A little more of a recent project, still about a decade old at this point, is the DAVE2 project that comes from NVIDIA from back in 2016. Here, the authors were interested in deploying behavior cloning also on an autonomous vehicle, and they wanted to see that the vehicle is able to navigate cones and work on streets that also have everyday objects. In the case of Alvin, there were no obstacles or lane changes that had to be performed, whereas for DAVE2, there were conditions that were a little more tricky to deal with. We just saw that naive behavior cloning led to a lot of unsafe results, and this is primarily because naive behavior cloning treats the state action pairs as mutually independent from each other, which means that if the agent ends up in a state that it has not seen before, it's possible for it to propose actions that are not optimal, and these cascading sequence of errors could lead to catastrophic failures. To deal with this problem, the DAVE2 team proposed something that was really interesting. What they made use of was these vehicles came with 3 different cameras, one that was forward-facing, which was the main camera that they wanted to use for behavior cloning, and also cameras that were placed to the left and the right and had a known relationship to the forward-facing camera. They used data from both the left and the right cameras as synthetic inputs because of this known relationship that existed. They used image from the left, for instance, and because they know exactly the amount of angle or the steering angle that one has to turn by to go from the left-facing image to the forward-facing direction, they showed that if we see something that looks like the left image, the recovery action that we need to take is to steer by that angle that will make it forward-facing. Similarly, if we see something that looks like the right image, we can then correct it so that it will look like it is forward-facing. In using these synthetic inputs, they were able to learn a policy that works much better. And you can see here that it results in behaviors that are a lot safer, and the vehicle is able to navigate in these conditions in a much more safe manner. Another project that is really interesting that makes use of behavior cloning is something that came just a few years ago, just a couple of years ago. And this makes use of generative AI or the advances in generative AI. This is a project called Diffusion Policy that comes from collaborations at the Toyota Research Institute and Stanford. And what they were looking at was, in the case of self-driving cars, a lot of the actions that we were looking at were either including categorical distributions or something that's a lot simpler to start working with. But in the case of continuous action spaces, like for instance, if we want to be able to spread pizza sauce on a pizza base, uh, picking up the pizza sauce already is a challenging problem because of the complex dynamics that exist. And then spreading this pizza sauce can again be a really challenging task. To be able to do this, the authors proposed a more expressive way for our action distribution by proposing a gradient field for the scoring function here. And during inference time, they iteratively optimize over with respect to this gradient. The details can be looked at in the paper itself, but the main thing that they showed here was by making use of a more expressive action distribution, they were able to start looking at policies that worked significantly better than what we were able to see using behavior cloning in the past. Another project that is really interesting is one that comes from Professor Xiaolong Wang's group at UCSD. This is also just about a couple of years old. And what they show here is making use of behavior cloning to be able to perform both manipulation and locomotion tasks. And that's what they call here as loco manipulation. And to be able to realize this, they made use of a very interesting demonstration device to be able to collect demonstrations from human experts. The degrees of freedom that come with humanoids are a lot more complex than just robot arms, for instance. Here, the way in which we're able to provide demonstrations then becomes really important, because if we are trying to control a humanoid robot just with, let's say, a joystick controller, we may not be able to control all degrees of freedoms really well. Here, they make use of a VR teleoperation headset. And the nice thing is the advances in VR teleoperation headsets allows us to have body pose estimation that are a lot more informative than just making use of, let's say, a joystick controller. If you want to think about the impact of degrees of freedom in training these policies, you can think about the difference between controlling a remote controlled car by making use of a mobile app that just allows us to go forward, back, left, or right, versus making use of a joystick that gives a lot more freedom in how we're able to navigate the vehicle. So to be able to get that information from the VR headsets allows us to learn policies that are as fascinating as we're seeing here in this project. They were able to show that the humanoid can then put together a ramen cooking scenario in this case. That being said, another series of approaches that we can take fall under this bucket of inverse reinforcement learning. We looked at a lot of examples for behavior cloning, and now we want to shift focus to start thinking about what inverse reinforcement learning does. Here, I want us to look at this video where a human is trying to perform a certain task, and what the child here is going to do is figure out how they can be useful for the human to be able to finish the task that they're interested in finishing. If we think of the baby here to be like an agent, if the agent was purely mimicking the actions of the human demonstrator, then the baby might go pick up a stack of books and perform the exact sequence of actions that the human demonstrator did. But instead, in these type of tasks, we are interested in providing assistance by understanding the intent of the demonstrator. Overall, there is a lot of benefit to be had to be able to complete tasks successfully by understanding what this underlying intent of our demonstrator is. What we're trying to do here is to learn user intent by pure observation and then make use of that information to be able to learn a policy that our agents can use to execute tasks autonomously. This process is what we call inverse reinforcement learning. This is also very similar to inverse optimal control for those of you who come from control theory backgrounds. The idea here is you can think of inverse reinforcement learning to be a little more of a general setting where for inverse optimal control type of problems, we think about scenarios where we're working in continuous systems that have known dynamics, but then we want to start working in stochastic environments, and that's where inverse reinforcement learning comes in relatively more handy. Grounding back in this image that we're already a little more familiar with at this point, when we're thinking about reinforcement learning, this is the image that we were looking at where this reward function is playing a crucial role in the training process for our policy. What we want to do for inverse reinforcement learning instead is to make use of these expert demonstrations to guide the learning process. Here, we still assume that we don't necessarily have access to the reward yet, but by making use of the expert demonstrations and looking at the state action mappings, we assume that there is some underlying reward that the human is trying to optimize these policies for. What we want to do in these cases is figure out what this reward function is that the human is optimizing on by making use of the samples that they're providing that they draw from this expert policy. And from this information, we figure out what the reward is and then go on to use this reward to be able to train our agent using reinforcement learning to figure out what the optimal policy pi theta is. The idea here is to have reinforcement learning to almost look like a subroutine within this inverse reinforcement learning process. Let's start thinking about what this exactly looks like through literature, because I think this can be slightly tricky when we're thinking about it abstractly. But the main thing to remember is, again, we have expert demonstrations and we are trying to recover an underlying reward function. And once we've recovered the reward function, we can then use it in a reinforcement learning approach to be able to optimize and figure out what a good policy pi theta is. This is also why inverse reinforcement learning problems are a little more challenging than making use of behavior cloning type of approaches. One of the seminal works that exist in inverse reinforcement learning type of settings is this work called heli-aerobatics that comes from Stanford way back in the late 2000s. The goal here is to have a helicopter to perform a certain series of tricks. And to be able to do this, it's going to be really hard for us to specify a reward function for each one of these tricks themselves. Maybe it is easier for us to show the exact demonstrations on how these tasks can be performed. So what this team did was make use of these demonstrations from different users. So they did not necessarily collect demonstrations only from experts. They treat humans as noisily optimal agents. What this means is humans don't necessarily perform exactly the perfect trajectory that we should be using for the agent, but rather they are going to be very close to the optimal trajectory, which is what we call noisily optimal. And in looking at a lot of information from different trajectories, we will be able to identify what this optimal trajectory that a lot of these humans are providing demonstrations for. The method that they made use of here is called apprenticeship learning, and we'll talk about it once we start discussing inverse reinforcement learning approaches. But the idea here is they make use of a feature-based reward function to be able to recover what the reward function looks like, and then they make use of that to be able to train a reinforcement learning policy. Another case of trying to treat humans as noisily optimal is this project for predicting pedestrian paths. And this is an example that we looked at in the previous video as well. Here, the blue dot is the robot, which is trying to estimate the decisions of a human and then go on to perform actions subsequently that account for the human decision making. Here, we go beyond what exactly the demonstrations the human has given us are. And in trying to do intent estimation, it makes use of a softmax version of Markov decision processes. It's a process called max entropy I.R.L, which we'll again be talking about. But the idea here is instead of treating human decision making as a deterministic process, we start thinking about decision making to be a little more probabilistic so that it can start accounting for the uncertainties that exist in human decisions. All this means is that when we're at a certain state, it's possible for us to take a few different actions instead of just taking a singular action that we'll be mapping out to. This allows the agent to be able to generalize to tasks beyond what exactly it observed in the demonstration data that was provided during training time. Another example that is one of Professor Brunton's favorites is this project called Learning Motor Primitives from the Max Planck Institute. Here, this is an example of the agent looking to learn how to perform a ball in a cup task. And we are looking at a human providing demonstrations by kinesthetically guiding the robot, which means that they're just showing exactly the sequence of actions to take to perform the ball in the cup action. And we make use of imitation learning to be able to first extract a reward function that we will then be able to make use of with reinforcement learning to be doing self-improvement. So once imitation learning is done in the first part, they noticed that the output was still off by about 13 centimeters. And then by making use of reinforcement learning and performing policy optimization over multiple different iterations, they start to see that the behavior is able to get much, much better over multiple trials. Here at 100 trials, we see that it was a success. Similarly, another task that they were looking at is this ball padding task, where they are interested in the robot performing a rhythmic action. And again, the demonstrator is kinesthetically guiding the robot on learning exactly how to perform these actions. And once we start training it using imitation learning, we see that the behavior is good to a certain extent. And after the reward function has been recovered from imitation learning, or from inverse reinforcement learning in this case, they then go on to use reinforcement learning to perform self-improvement, and the policies are able to start looking much better. Another example that we can start thinking about is this project called guided cost learning, where we're starting to move away from these feature-based representations for the reward function. In the three examples that we saw in the past, the reward functions were still feature-based, which means that there's a good amount of human engineering that is needed to specify exactly what the reward function should look like. With guided cost learning, what we started seeing was, for the first time, roughly in 2016, this is one of the first projects to show the use of neural networks for reward functions instead of specifying explicit feature-based reward functions. Here, the human will initially show demonstrations of what they want to do. Here, for instance, they are looking to place plates in this dish rack. And we'll also be looking at another case where the human is interested in pouring some sort of objects from the orange cup to the yellow cup right here. So they're showing demonstrations, and by using a more expressive way of providing what the reward function should look like, they were able to show that we are able to recover more nonlinear behaviors, and things work a lot better in these cases. One last project in the inverse reinforcement learning realm that could be interesting for us to talk about is this cross-embodiment inverse reinforcement learning project that comes from DeepMind from back in 2021. Here, the idea is for us to be able to make use of task progress as a way to identify what type of reward we'll be able to recover. So the goal here is when we have multiple different robots and we have certain tasks that we're interested in establishing, we don't want to learn from scratch every time we have to execute the certain task. We should have a way in which things that I learn on one robot can still be useful for me to execute on a different robot. Or in this case, things that I can learn from human demonstrations in videos can still be useful for me to train a robot to execute similar tasks autonomously by itself. The way they do this is by making use of task progress as a way of learning how to perform a certain task. And they look at the difference, at the negative distance between our current state and the goal state in the embedding space as a reward function. And they use that information to be able to work with reinforcement learning to optimize a policy that allows us to go from these human demonstrations to executing tasks on a robot autonomously. So there's this cross embodiment that we're able to realize because of solving inverse reinforcement learning type of problems. These are just a subset of examples that exist in the literature for both behavior cloning or inverse reinforcement learning. But the idea here was to show some of these different considerations that we need to have when we're starting to solve these problems. Let's quickly think about the different types of demonstrations that we can make use of for imitation learning. When we're thinking about both the teleoperation scenario that we saw in the loco manipulation task from Xiaolong Wang's group, for instance, or in the cases where we are making use of a device to control something that is happening remotely. In this case, we're making use of a haptic device called Phantom Omni to show demonstration data on exactly how a certain task has to be done. This can serve really well to be able to inform agents how they should perform learning. A lot of data in the literature actually relies on teleoperation information that we're able to collect from users. Another type of demonstration, like in the ball and the cup example, is by guiding the robot physically through the sequence of actions that it needs to take to be able to perform a certain task. This is called kinesthetic imitation, where the user is showing exactly how to perform a certain sequence of actions for the robot to then learn from. This means that the demonstration action space and the action space of the task itself are the same. This may not necessarily be the case for teleoperation, because we saw that when we, for instance, are using a joystick to control a humanoid, that's going to be very different from when we use a VR headset to control a humanoid or show demonstrations for a humanoid. So that's something to keep in mind when we start thinking about different sources of demonstrations as well. One other way could be making use of motion capture markers to provide demonstration information. In this case, we can also think of motion capture markers that we can place on a certain face, and we're able to animate different characters by making use of data that comes from motion capture. We can use behavior cloning in these scenarios, and there are studies in the past that show that this works pretty well. So motion capture is another source of demonstration. In another case, we can think about ways in which we can purely use video information to be able to perform imitation learning. In the case of the cross-embodiment inverse reinforcement learning examples, we saw that we are able to track task progress just from video data to then learn the type of actions that our robot has to perform. This is what we call visual imitation, where we're trying to go from video data to be able to perform actions with a physical agent. These are just a subset of demonstrations. There are a lot more ways in which demonstrations can be provided. For instance, if you think of a user interface like your phone, there are demonstrations that we can provide through this interface as well, and that data can be used to perform behavior cloning type of approaches. Now, finally, I also want to just summarize all the different things that we've seen in this video, in addition to the different types of demonstrations that we looked at. We saw that the insights that we can draw from demonstrations can come in one of two forms. We can either directly mimic the actions of the demonstrator. So we can answer this question of how can my agent incorporate others' decisions into their own by purely mimicking their actions? Or we saw that it is possible for us to estimate the intent of the agent and then go on to use that information to train an optimal policy. So the question we were looking at here is, how can my agent understand the demonstrator's objectives to be able to work with scenarios that are a little more generalizable beyond purely mimicking actions? In the first case, this is nothing but behavior cloning. So we are just trying to mimic the actions of our expert. And in the second case, in trying to understand the intent of our demonstrator, we are trying to solve inverse reinforcement learning type of problems. Just to start thinking about what these problems look like mathematically, behavior cloning is trying to build out a mapping between my states and my actions to estimate what this optimal policy pi star is from the demonstration data. And in the case of inverse reinforcement learning, what we're trying to do is learn a reward function and then go on to use that reward function in a reinforcement learning subroutine to learn what the optimal policy pi star is. The policy pi star is what we assume comes from the data of the demonstrator. Another thing to think about is reward functions can be a more compact representation of how to perform good actions than directly just having a certain sequence of trajectories that we are trying to replicate. So reward functions in that sense could help us generalize a little better. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.